He was just 50 meters from the top of the world when everything went dark. Exhausted, blind, and staggering in the death zone of Everest, Thomas Weber's final climb turned into one of the mountain's most haunting tragedies. Weber wasn't the strongest climber on the mountain, and he wasn't there to break records. He was a man who had already survived a brain tumor, left with vision that failed him at high altitude, and he was determined to prove that his condition wouldn't stop him from standing on the roof of the world. But Everest has a way of stripping climbers bare, and what happened to Weber that day exposed the razor-thin line between ambition and survival. Thomas Weber's story wasn't like most who set their sights on Everest. Years earlier, he had undergone surgery to remove a brain tumor, a battle that left him partially blind. At sea level, he could manage, but in the thin air of high altitude, his vision would blur until he was effectively climbing in darkness. For Weber, reaching Everest wasn't about chasing glory. It was about proving that his limitations didn't define him. Friends described him as determined, even stubborn, with a drive that sometimes pushed him beyond reason. And that drive would take him to a place few climbers ever dare to go. But climbing Everest isn't just about personal willpower. It's about survival in an environment where even the smallest mistake can be fatal. And as Weber prepared for his final summit push in May 2006, the mountain was about to test his limits in ways no one could have imagined. By late May of 2006, the Everest season was already notorious. Storms, bottlenecks, and a string of tragedies had turned the world's highest mountain into a graveyard in the clouds. Yet for Thomas Weber, this was the moment he had been waiting for. At 8,000 meters, climbers enter what's called the death zone, where the human body slowly shuts down with every breath. For Weber, whose eyesight was already compromised, the risks were multiplied. Guided by Harry Keekstra, a well-known climber, Weber pushed higher into the thinning air. At first, he seemed strong enough, moving slowly but steadily, but the higher he went, the more his vision began to fade. By the time he reached above 8,600 meters, he was effectively blind. Every step became a gamble, every foothold a matter of trust in his guide's voice. Witnesses later recalled how he stumbled, unsteady and disoriented, his balance faltering as if the mountain itself was pulling him off course. Still, Weber pressed on. His ambition was locked on the summit, just a few hundred meters above. But ambition doesn't hold much weight in the death zone. The air was too thin, his body too drained, and soon his fight against the mountain was slipping out of his control. And what happened next would be the moment where everything turned. At around 8,750 meters, Weber was less than 50 meters from the top. To most climbers, that final stretch is a lifetime dream within reach. But for him, it became an impossible wall. His strength had drained away. His steps slowed to a crawl. And then, with no warning, he stopped. Harry Keekstra tried to guide him, urging him to keep moving, but Weber's body wasn't responding. He staggered in place, unable to find balance, his blindness leaving him completely dependent on the voices around him. Climbers nearby described him as totally exhausted, a man running on nothing but determination. At that altitude, determination is rarely enough. Finally, Keekstra made the call. They had to turn back. The summit would remain untouched, but even the descent became a desperate struggle. Weber collapsed into the snow, his breathing shallow, whispering the words, "I am dying." Moments later, his body gave out. In the thin air of Everest's death zone, there are no second chances. His guide tried to pull him up, but Weber's strength had vanished. And then, in one of the most chilling moments reported on Everest, he slipped away completely, his climb ending just below the top of the world. But the tragedy wasn't just his alone. It came during one of Everest's deadliest seasons, a time that would raise disturbing questions about why so many were dying on the mountain. Thomas Weber's death didn't happen in isolation. The spring of 2006 became one of the most infamous seasons in Everest history. Over 40 climbers would lose their lives that year, many of them on the very same north side route where Weber collapsed. The mountain had turned into a corridor of suffering, where climbers stepped past bodies frozen in the snow, each one a warning that few could afford to heed. It was a season that exposed the brutal reality of Everest's commercialization. Hundreds of climbers, some experienced, others dangerously unprepared, crowded into the death zone, each chasing their personal dream. Guides were overwhelmed, oxygen supplies stretched thin, and rescue efforts were nearly impossible above 8,000 meters. In that chaos, climbers like Weber faced an unforgiving truth. Once you falter up there, very few can save you. What made Weber's case even more haunting was how vulnerable he already was. Blindness in the death zone meant he was climbing on trust alone, every step depending on others. Yet, Everest isn't a place where teamwork always holds. Up there, survival narrows to the individual. Climbers who pass a fallen man often aren't heartless. They're simply powerless. To stop is to risk their own life. And in 2006, that deadly calculation played out over and over again. Weber's fall into the snow wasn't just one man's tragedy. It became a symbol of how far climbers were willing to push themselves, even when the mountain had already made it clear who would and would not survive. But the question remained, why did it go so wrong for him in particular? Looking back at Thomas Weber's final hours, it's clear his tragedy wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was a chain of risks that all collided in the death zone. The first and most obvious was his health. Years earlier, the surgery that saved his life also cost him his vision. At lower altitudes, Weber could manage. But on Everest, where oxygen levels dropped to 1/3 of what's available at sea level, his sight faded to nothing. By the time he reached the summit ridge, he was completely blind. Climbing blind at 8,700 meters isn't just dangerous, it's nearly impossible. The second factor was exhaustion. Climbers in the death zone burn through their strength faster than they realize. Even the healthiest athletes can collapse if they push too hard, and Weber's body was already fighting an uphill battle. Witnesses described him as staggering, unable to find balance and leaning heavily on his guide for every step. At that point, his body wasn't climbing anymore. It was simply breaking down. Then came the altitude sickness. Above 8,000 meters, the lack of oxygen doesn't just weaken the muscles, it clouds the mind. Climbers make poor decisions, lose focus, and sometimes slip into delirium. For Weber, who was already disoriented without vision, the effects of altitude were magnified. He wasn't just fighting Everest, he was fighting his own body shutting down. Together, these factors created the perfect storm. Blindness, exhaustion, and altitude sickness combined in a place where no mistakes are forgiven. When Weber whispered his final words, "I am dying," it wasn't drama. It was the raw truth of what happens when human determination collides with the limits of survival. But his death also forced the climbing world to ask a much bigger question. Was Everest itself changing, or were the climbers who came to it unprepared for what they faced? Thomas Weber's death became part of a larger conversation about the way Everest was being climbed. By 2006, the mountain wasn't just a test for elite mountaineers, it had become a business. Commercial expeditions promised to take clients to the summit for a price, often filling the routes with people who had little high-altitude experience. Sherpas and guides carried the heaviest loads, set the ropes, and risked their lives, while climbers with deep pockets chased a dream that sometimes turned fatal. Weber's case raised difficult questions. Should a man with failing eyesight have been allowed to attempt Everest at all? Was it an act of courage, or a dangerous gamble encouraged by the very industry that profited from it? His death forced people to confront the thin line between determination and recklessness. And it wasn't just about Weber. His story reflected a larger truth about the mountain itself. Everest is often called the ultimate adventure, but at its core, it's also a place where ambition collides with survival. Every season, climbers step past frozen bodies, reminders of those who thought they could beat the mountain. Guides like Harry Kikstra argued that they did everything possible for Weber, but Everest doesn't bend to effort or good intentions. It remains an unrelenting judge of human limits. For many, Weber's story became a warning, proof that Everest doesn't forgive weakness, and that the mountain doesn't care about your reasons for being there. Blindness, determination, or the dream of proving something to yourself. None of it matters if the mountain decides otherwise. But Weber's tragedy also leaves us with one last haunting question. What drives people to keep risking everything for a chance at the summit? Thomas Weber's climb ended just steps away from glory, but it's the way he died, blind, exhausted, and whispering his final words, that makes his story unforgettable. His death wasn't just a single tragedy on a mountain full of them. It was a reminder of what Everest really is. For some, it's the ultimate test of endurance. For others, it's a dangerous business where ambition is sold at the cost of human life. Weber went to Everest not as the strongest climber, but as someone determined to prove that his blindness didn't define him. In the end, though, the mountain exposed the truth that determination alone can't conquer nature's limits. His story stands as both an inspiration and a warning. Courage can take you far, but on Everest, it can also take you too far. And that's why his final climb still haunts so many. Because at its heart, Thomas Weber's death forces us to ask a question that has no easy answer. How much are we willing to risk? Our health, our safety, even our lives, for the chance to stand on top of the world?